Conforme la crisis creció, los activistas a través de los Estados Unidos respondieron de maneras muy diferentes. En Nueva York, los exiliados políticos y los simpatizantes locales formaron una red de organizaciones nuevas, incluyendo CISPES, el Comité de Solidaridad con los Salvadoreños, INALCE, el Instituto de Artistas Salvadoreños y escritores en el exilio. Y en el verano de 1983, Artists Call Against U.S. Intervention in Latin America.
Okay. And now, we should have two, but I don't know where the other ones are. I just keep going. I'm going to go off the text now, okay? Because there's an important point here, I think, that has to do with the way that these historical contexts of solidarity are founded. It wasn't necessarily that artists like myself we were already sympathetic to the political disaster that the United States government was building in Central and South America.
Ok, sí es un hecho que nosotros, bueno, está fuera ya sin el texto, que nosotros como artistas ya simpatizamos con las atrocidades que cometía Estados Unidos en Centro y Suramérica.
We were also informed because of the way that death squad activity, particularly in El Salvador, had taken on a level of violence also against American community workers within the region.
Y también estábamos informados del nivel de violencia con que estos acontecimientos se estaban dando, y no solo contra los salvadoreños, sino también contra trabajadores estadounidenses que estaban en la zona.
But it was the face-to-face moment, because New York became more and more full of intellectuals, particularly after they closed the University of El Salvador. New York became full of artists actually in exile who were in the room, and I like to use this term because it's the sort of the space in which politics is made. In the end, we can project about how politics is built, but in the end, politics is made in the actual room, and who is there, and who is able to represent an idea or a sensibility. And New York was changed from after the violence of 1980, and existing artists, Catalina Parra, Joseline Carvalho, art historians like Dory Ashton and Lucy Lepard began to organize contexts in which artists could meet and share the sense of desperation around these political events.
Entonces no es solo que estábamos informados de lo que estaba ocurriendo, sino que también lo vivíamos en Nueva York, porque tras el cierre de la Universidad del Salvador, Nueva York se llenó de artistas en exilio, y se convirtió como una especie de habitación, y lo comparo con una habitación porque considero que la política finalmente se hace en habitaciones cerradas, y Nueva York se convirtió en una especie de habitación donde convivíamos con estos artistas y varios curadores que él menciona. The names are Joseline
Carvalho, Catalina Parra, who's related to Victor Parra, who was a singer in Chile. The overthrow of the government in Chile had happened 10 years before. So there was, in a sense, a context of residue from those devastating historical events, but also a concentration of aesthetic investment in the possibility of rethinking them.
Sí, había una concentración de... Sí.
Oh, sorry.
Había una concentración dice residue, de residuos de esos acontecimientos. Había un contexto vivo en el que se hablaba y se discutía sobre lo que estaba ocurriendo.
Also, and I think this is important to stress, in places in which there are emergent contexts for an alternative art scene, that in New York, the alternative arts movement, which began probably in the early 70s, had already set up a place in which art was exhibited through and by artists on their own. Artists had taken agency already for the distribution and organization of their work in local establishments like Artist Space, White Columns, collaborative projects, Fashion Moda, that is, artists organizing to be able to distribute and present and promote artworks independently and autonomously from the hierarchies of museums and galleries.
Esto coincidió con que ya desde los años 70 ya se había establecido una escena del arte alternativa, independiente, en el que los artistas publicaban y exhibían sus trabajos de manera independiente de los museos o de las grandes galerías, y esta plataforma sirvió también para este propósito.
Worried about time. Also important for many North American educators and artists in the 80s were the social and humanitarian gains in the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua, in particular the literary campaigns and artist communities founded by the poet priest Ernesto Cardenal and other artists and writers in Nicaragua.
También fue muy provechoso los movimientos de alfabetización y de culturización que se dio en Latinoamérica a través de las revoluciones guiadas por Monseñor
Ernesto Cardenal.
Ernesto Cardenal.
His insistence on the structural intimacy between the emotional affect, the affect of poetry, and the spiritual effect of anti-poverty organizing were reflected in much of the cultural and political activism of the region, but also reflected within the community organizing politics in New York City itself. You could talk about liberation theology. Or
Sus ideas sobre el efecto del arte y la poética, también como una herramienta de cambio social, influenciaron mucho nuestra visión en Nueva York.
So it was clear to us that the links between exiled culture in New York City and the existing social imperatives of artists struggling to represent themselves in North America needed a form. It needed a space. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm skipping. 4 after the word button. 4. Okay, you choose. And I was really confused.
Se hizo cada vez más claro el vínculo entre la cultura en el exilio y los imperativos sociales existentes de los artistas en Norteamérica, que necesitaban una forma para expresarse.
In June of 1982, Group Material, the collective of artists that I was part of, organized an exhibition called Luchar, an exhibition for the people of Central America. This was 1 year before the Artist Call organizing had begun.
Un año antes de que se fundara el Artist Call, el grupo al que yo pertenecía hizo una exposición. The name of the exhibition was Luchar. Luchar.
An exhibition for the people of Central
Una exhibición para los centroamericanos.
This show would have been impossible. I'm sorry, no, skip that sentence. This exhibition acted as a kind of social context. It took place in a community center called the Taller Latinoamericano.
Okay, se hizo esta exposición en un contexto de un salón comunal o una casa de la cultura llamados, what was it called?
Taller Latinoamericano.
Taller Latinoamericano.
But the works in the show were produced both by community activists and established artists. So you could have an artist that had worked with Nicaraguan children in Managua and done paintings, which I showed earlier that those children had made. But you would also have an artist like Leon Golub, Anna Mendieta, Martha Rosler, Hans Haka, artists who had a sort of larger relationship to the critical art establishment.
Entonces en esta exhibición participaron tanto activistas con sus propias pinturas, activistas que habían trabajado en Centroamérica con niños, como también artistas establecidos como Ana Mendieta y otros que él mencionó, artistas que ya tenían un vínculo con el mercado del arte, con el mundo del arte.
At the opening, representatives from the FDR-FMLN, organizers of solidarity organizations within the United States, artists, journalists, and musicians spoke about the relationship between aesthetics and politics, read poetry, and gave performances.
En la inauguración participaron representantes de derechos humanos, activistas, artistas y periodistas, y todos leyeron poesía y enfatizaron la importancia de la relación entre el arte y la política.
Today it may seem unusual to see a room full of simultaneous artistic and political activity in which each critiques and celebrates the function of the other.
Hoy en día nos puede parecer raro ver un espacio de exhibición en el que coexisten expresiones de arte y política en los que el arte celebra la política celebra el arte.
It's also important for me to mention that at this period in the early 80s in New York, the art world was very committed to a kind of neo-expressionist investment in the white male heteronormative hero. By looking at this work from today, we might think that the whole city was full of a kind of dialogic political aesthetic, but the dominant art world was very much invested in a privatized, singular idea of the artist hero as someone who's translating the world for the rich.
Okay. Al ver esto podríamos hacernos de la idea que Nueva York estaba lleno de espacios como estos que mezclaban arte y política, pero en realidad el modelo dominante en el arte era el que enaltecía al hombre blanco heterosexual que creaba arte y que era como el héroe artístico, pero estos espacios eran pocos.
The image that I showed you before was at the opening, and at that opening the man who was photographed in the earlier photograph announced the beginning of this organization called INALCE, the Institute of Artists and Writers in Exile in New York City. His name is Daniel Flores Asensio.
Sí, el hombre que vimos en la fotografía anterior es Daniel Flores Ascensión y él en ese momento estaba anunciando el inicio del INALCE, que es INALCE es
Institute of Arts and Letters in Exile.
Instituto de Artes y Escritores en el Exilio.
I wanted to show some more images. I'm off text now. Some of these are not across the street. Across the street there are two panels, and I think it is important to sort of point this out in terms of the relationship between artists' artistic labor, and the way that organizational systems can develop. On one case across the street is a representation of this exhibition, which was done by Group Material independently, but invited artists from North and South America to participate, and then that led to a larger production, which was Artist Call.
Okay, que esto no está al frente, pero de este trabajo según lo que le entendí, de este trabajo a partir de ese trabajo se invitaron a un grupo de artistas de diferentes movimientos sociales que crearon un trabajo todavía mayor, más grande.
Also interesting is the way that formally there are relationships between the work of sort of street artists in New York and poster collective called OSPAL in Cuba. On the lower left is a poster by OSPAL. It's OSPAAL. I don't know what it stands for, but it was a poster collective that ran, someone, art historian in the room may know, that ran out of Havana from right after the revolution through the late 60s.
Entonces también se estableció una relación entre artistas callejeros de Nueva York con el colectivo de afiches de La Habana, que se llama OSPAL, y esta relación entre artistas callejeros de Nueva York y el colectivo de afiches duró desde los 60s, it ran until the 80s.
Marina knows the name.
El colectivo de
OSPAL.
Okay, y continúa. Sí.
Still.
Yeah, she says it's still running.
And also the documentary photographs from the scene of conflict, paintings that were made by people in the areas around the scenes of conflict, and paintings made by New Yorkers around the idea of conflict.
Okay. Entonces aquí tenemos, could you leave it?
Oh yeah, sure.
Fotografía documental tomada en las áreas de conflicto, pinturas hechas por personas que vivían ese conflicto y al lado también pinturas de artistas de Nueva York representando lo que era ese conflicto.
And here you see a really good comparison. The photograph at the top is the pile of bodies in which there were 4 Dutch journalists found in 1982, which kind of activated the governmental resistance in Europe to United States militaristic policies. Europe turned against these policies quite earlier than the United States did, obviously. And then in the below it, there is one of the greatest posters that's produced by Aspal, I think, which shows such graphic intelligence and clarity.
Ok, entonces arriba lo que tenemos es una fotografía de una pila de cuerpos, entre los cuales están los cuerpos de 4 periodistas holandeses, y fue esta fotografía la que movió finalmente a que Europa se rechazara la intervención violenta de los Estados Unidos en Centroamérica, y abajo uno de los afiches más emblemáticos de Ospal.
And this is the letter that Daniel Flores first organized through the exhibition with a bunch of young, crazy artists at Taller Americano. He used that as a kind of political and social legitimacy to approach people at another level. Noel Carrera, who was the consul from Nicaragua, and Dory Ashton, who was probably one of the more established art historians from the days of abstract expressionism in New York.
Entonces, con esta carta, Daniel Flores llegó a miembros de otras esferas, como por ejemplo una curadora muy importante que él menciona, y también al cónsul de Nicaragua, llevó la experiencia de lo que había sido esta exhibición.
I mean, it's very interesting to me now looking back, because the levels of aesthetic sort of like projection, the way you say, well, I have an idea for something, but I don't know how to make it work, and the practical organizing skills of political organizing were always becoming, in a sense, interchanging. Like, how can I describe something to someone else so they will feel that they have to take action?
Él le parece muy interesante ese vínculo entre cuando uno tiene una idea y no sabe cómo realizarla, llevado al ámbito político de cómo quiero lograr un cambio, pero no sé cómo realizarlo. Entonces, las destrezas de organización del mundo político aplicados también a las ideas artísticas.
And also, I think, unprecedented, and something for us to think back to, particularly in New York. I don't know if it's something to think back to here, but was the different levels within the hierarchy of art production that were working together. So here's an organizing committee meeting taken by a photographer, I don't remember who, in which there is John Hendricks of the Guerrilla Art Action Group, Daniel Flores, the painter Leon Golub, the art historian Lucy Lepard, the street artist Christy Rupp, myself, the curator Kosha van Bruggen, who ran the Stedelijk in Amsterdam. I don't know if that all means anything, but it's people from very different levels, right, within the way that the art world functions normally, all working together.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was the urgency of the moment. I don't know if it was that there were photographs in the New York Times. I don't know if it was that they killed American nuns, but for some reason, I also think it had to do with the people involved. There was a way in which the art world overall was able to respond. And I think aesthetics and the projection of aesthetics has something to do with this. The way that aesthetics projects an idea of aspiration into something outside of people's immediate environment. Sorry, that was too long.
Okay. Que a él lo que le llama particularmente la atención, pero no sabe si es algo que es un fenómeno muy de Nueva York y por eso a él le llama la atención, es el hecho que diferentes niveles o dentro de la jerarquía del mundo del arte estaban trabajando en conjunto. Había artistas callejeros, había curadores, menciona a gente que, pues, la ex curadora del Stedelijk en Ámsterdam, por ejemplo. Entonces, diferentes artistas, curadores, artistas callejeros, estaban trabajando juntos por una estética, por lograr un cambio, que es algo que raramente sucede, ese trabajo colectivo.
Sorry, I should just mention very quickly. Like, this is the part where it gets difficult for me because I want to talk about the philosophical implications of artist call, but I also feel it's an imperative to actually describe in detail physically what levels of institutional weight were motivated to move, or of institutional capacity were changed. Okay. In other words, like, I want to talk about the dream, but really the practical work is so phenomenal and is so like unimaginable in today's New York art world that I feel I need to actually say what we did, the physical work we did.
Okay. Me encantaría contarles de mis aspiraciones filosóficas o de mis divagaciones, sí, mis aspiraciones filosóficas del Artist's Call, pero en realidad considero que es tan impresionante la maquinaria institucional que logramos mover y lo que realmente logramos hacer en el nivel práctico, que en lugar de contarles del aspecto filosófico de este movimiento, les voy a contar las cosas que sí efectivamente movimos.
So this is the beginning where we write a letter to other artists saying, just give us $50. And we ask other artists first to sign this letter, to say, can we use your name in a letter, where we ask people for whatever money they can give us. And then from that money, we raise enough to then start to approach other people for other money. This happened very quickly over a 3-month period.
Okay, muy rápidamente, en un periodo de 3 meses, lo que hicimos fue este documento con el que nos dirigíamos a artistas establecidos, pidiéndoles una contribución de $50 con tal de poder tener, sumar su nombre a nuestra causa y de esa manera dirigirnos a otros artistas.
Klaus Oldenburg, who was clearly like a global presence, global figure in the art world, also, which in a sense is maybe a secret history, had always since the 60s been involved in a subversive poster practice in New York, where he worked with another artist named Irving Petlin and the Guerrilla Art Action Group to fund and produce street posters. So he was available to us to help design the publicity.
Bueno, Klaus Oldenburg, que ya había pertenecido a un movimiento de arte callejero, de posters callejeros, él desde los años 60 se sumó también con su apoyo.
In January of 1984, Artist Call announced 6 months of exhibitions, events, and demonstrations in a full-page ad in the New York Times, a reproduction of which is in the gallery.
Okay. En la galería allá pueden ver una reproducción de la carta que publicamos, o de la invitación que se publicó en New York Times, en la que se anunciaba que iban a haber 6 meses seguidos de exhibiciones y de eventos artísticos organizados por el Artist Call.
30 exhibitions in private galleries, 3 museums, and all the alternative spaces in New York City.
30 exhibiciones en galerías privadas, 3 museos y todos los espacios públicos para exhibición en Nueva York.
All the work was for sale. 100% of the proceeds going to artists and education projects in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and to solidarity organizations in New York.
Todo el trabajo estaba a la venta y las ganancias se iban a donar a movimientos de solidaridad en Nueva York y movimientos de apoyo en Nicaragua y en El Salvador.
An auction that sells the artworks of all the artists who could not be put into the galleries, but other galleries turning over their spaces to group exhibitions, including Barbara Gladstone, Paula Cooper Gallery, and Leo Castelli.
Okay, él menciona 3 galerías establecidas que dieron su espacio para exhibir artistas y también se hicieron subastas para las obras que no estaban en espacios, en galerías.
Try to imagine the 3 major commercial entities of New York City today turning over their spaces and the profits that they make from those spaces to a politically progressive, organizing, international cause.
Entonces, imagínense 3 espacios de los más establecidos comerciales, del arte comercial, dedicando sus paredes para arte que iba a ser vendida y que esa plata iba a ser destinada a un movimiento internacional de solidaridad.
These openings were coordinated. The covers of art magazines and contents in art magazines were organized around the exhibitions.
Las revistas, las portadas de las revistas del arte hablaban de estas exhibiciones.
2 months of poetry readings, musical concerts, 3 performance art venues, PS1, the Performance Space 122. These names may not mean anything here, but basically the whole alternative art scene of New York was turned over to this work.
Toda la escena del arte alternativa de Nueva York estaba vertida hacia esta iniciativa.
So I think in short, an important way to think about it was that obviously the primary purpose of the effort was to physically demonstrate support for the popular movements of this region and to resist the interventionist policies of the U.S. government. But instead of making a context for others to participate in, we as artists were participating in a context of social struggle that was made by others. So in other words, we were also participating in what we felt was a revolutionary movement that was happening around us. And this reflects to what I tried to say at the beginning about the relationship between North and South, between distance, and the sort of misrecognition that solidarity or affinity, political affinity, produces, which I'm hoping we can have some questions about. But anyway, just to keep to the facts, right? We as artists were participating in a context of social and aesthetic struggle that was already made by others.
Sí, nosotros como artistas estábamos participando en una lucha social y estética que había sido iniciada por otros. Nosotros estábamos participando en algo que habían iniciado otros, en una lucha que era la de otros.
So in a sense, the list that I just read to you shows the breadth and strength of what it could mean politically within the cultural industry of New York. But equally important was the representation of political desire of artists that were joining into a growing public consciousness of the U.S. government's war-making efforts. I can re-say it amongst themselves, created political consciousness as artists.
El hecho de que los artistas se agruparan entre ellos ya estaba creando una conciencia política como artistas.
And for me, looking historically, this opened the door for there to be subsequent investments by artists in the idea of political discourse. ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power in the 1980s.
Y para mí esto fue el origen o la razón por la que luego, posteriormente, los artistas empezaron a crear otros movimientos políticos como los que se menciona.
ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power.
ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Release Power.
Right,
Son
and
movimientos
WAC, the Women's Action Coalition.
Y WAC, bueno, la coalición de acción femenina de las mujeres.
But the broad industrial investment that Artist Call was able to project into the art world, by industry I mean the galleries and museums, positioned a kind of left partisanship within the art industry as no longer possibly neutral.
Sí, lo que se logró finalmente fue establecer una afinidad hacia la izquierda en el mundo del arte, o sea que ya el arte ya no podía permanecer neutral.
And I also want to point out today, with a massive global rebirth of the false neutrality of art's distributional and display context, that the activism of art spaces around political aspiration seems as revolutionary today as it would have been back then.
Y aún hoy en día parece ser revolucionario el hecho de poder llevar al mundo industrial del arte, al mundo corporativo del arte, las galerías, una visión política. Lo que se logró en ese momento sigue siendo hoy en día algo revolucionario.
So I think I'm gone on quite long. I want to quickly go over Group Material's contribution to Artist Call. So the first exhibition I showed you was called Luchar, and that helped get Artist Call started. Once Artist Call was working, Group Material itself also wanted to make an exhibition as part of Artist Call.
Group Material, con su trabajo, ayudó a establecer el grupo Artist Call, pero una vez que estaba establecido el Artist Call, Group Material continúa haciendo sus propias exhibiciones.
But before I do that, I maybe want to just describe one anecdote, which I think is very important in relationship to political and cultural democracy.
Antes de contarles de esta exhibición, les voy a contar una anécdota que me parece relevante cuando hablamos de la relación entre política y cultura.
This is a photograph of the last meeting of the organizing committee of Artist Call. You can see it's much bigger than the earlier photograph I showed you.
Esta es una foto de una de las reuniones del comité de Artist Call. Como se pueden dar cuenta, el grupo es cada vez más grande, es más grande, hay más gente que en la primera foto que les mostré.
And it was interesting because all these efforts actually did raise money. The artwork was sold. The profits were given to Artist Call to distribute the way that we wanted to. And there was a conflict at this meeting.
Y es interesante porque en esta reunión había un conflicto. A este punto ya se había logrado que las ganancias de las ventas por arte se donaran para la distribución de más arte de tipo político.
Because with those resources, a political movement could have continued in New York, and there was a significant amount of people involved who wanted that to happen. In other words, saying, look, now we have the resources, we can actually change things, so let's make a permanent institution a permanent organizing committee.
Okay, entonces con los recursos que se disponía en ese momento, se podía continuar con un proyecto político, se podía crear una institución de arte y política ya para poder cambiar las cosas de manera permanente.
And at that time there was he's still around, his name is John Hendricks. He organizes the work of Yoko Ono today and is part of Fluxus.
Bueno, en ese momento estaba un señor John Hendricks, que él es uno de los que promueve el trabajo de Yoko Ono.
And John gave a really wonderful speech, a kind of anarchistic speech, but one that I think is important in relationship to the idea of aesthetics and politics. He said, sometimes politics is best if it happens temporarily, that it organizes itself around a moment, and when the moment is gone, we go home.
Entonces, John Hendricks dio un discurso muy importante sobre la relación entre estética y política, y en este discurso él recalcaba que a veces la política es muy buena cuando es temporal, cuando promueve o produce un movimiento que dura lo que dura ese momento histórico.
So we wrote the checks and we went home.
Entonces firmamos los cheques y nos fuimos para la casa.
So this very briefly now is Group Materials contribution to Artist Call.
Y esa es la contribución de Group Material al Group Artist Call.
And I'm going to, I think, get rid of this paper altogether. The idea that we had was inspired by one of the activist organizations who made a list of United States military interventions in the region.
Esta exhibición está inspirada en el trabajo en un trabajo que se había hecho anteriormente por un activista, que es como una línea de tiempo de todas las intervenciones de los Estados Unidos en la región, en Centroamérica.
And when you see this list, and it's posted now on the outside of TEORETICA,
y cuando ustedes ven la lista de estas intervenciones que está ahorita publicada en la fachada de TEORETICA,
particularly at that time in America and for most North Americans, the idea that there was that many actual military interventions where troops were actually sent was not something that is part of most high school history courses.
Y esta información de la cantidad de intervenciones de intervenciones militares que se estaban dando de parte de Estados Unidos a través del mundo es una información que la mayoría de los estudiantes de colegio no tienen.
So our idea was, in a sense, to take the two-dimensional idea of the timeline and the markings of those physical interventions of military of militarism.
Entonces nuestra idea fue hacer una representación gráfica de una línea del tiempo marcada por estas intervenciones militares.
And to, in a sense, expand those two dimensions into three, to take the way that history moves chronologically from here to there, and to make it happen around a room in a relation across space.
Okay. Y lo que quisimos fue llevar esta representación bidimensional de una línea del tiempo a abrir un espacio tridimensional, representándola en un espacio de habitaciones que nos llevan a través del espacio.
So in a way to spatialize time.
Es como darle una dimensión espacial al tiempo.
By doing that, from my perspective, a viewer in the room has to organize themselves in relationship to their own memories.
Entonces con esto, desde mi punto de vista, el espectador de la galería, el que llega a ver la muestra, tiene que organizar sus memorias, tiene que darle un orden a sus memorias conforme va viendo esta representación.
And we all know the way that memory acts as a critique of official history, that we remember things in a way that is never really the same as it's presented to us by history books and by newspapers.
Y esto lleva una reflexión sobre la forma como nosotros recordamos o percibimos los momentos históricos a partir de nuestra memoria, que lo que nosotros recordamos nunca es lo mismo que leemos en los libros de historia, es diferente de cómo se nos presenta.
And so the associations between the actual events of military and barbaric intervention could be, in a sense, then reflected through and around the aesthetic intervention of artworks.
Entonces, Es como el arte, la representación estética puede llevar una reflexión sobre la representación de los acontecimientos históricos.
It's important to mention also that for us, the actual teleological or the ordered idea of the chronological notion of time, we wanted to also interrupt that.
Queríamos interrumpir la noción lineal cronológica del tiempo.
So in some instances, the photo document of the death of Che Guevara, for instance, is at a date around which it happened, but at other times the dates are completely off kilter.
Ajá. Entonces, por ejemplo, la foto del cuerpo del Che allá está ubicada en el tiempo que le corresponde, pero hay otras imágenes que están totalmente desfasadas con la fecha.
And for instance, here there's a print by Honor Dormier about the injustices that were happening in France in the beginning of the 19th century, and that is also placed chronologically, but the Tina Madadi photograph on the other side of the room is presented at a time after she was dead.
Entonces, esta obra de un artista del principios del siglo XX está colocado en la fecha que le corresponde, pero una fotografía de Tina Modotti posterior está en una época que no es la propia, no es la suya.
So in a sense, by like trying to pull apart the supposedly totalizing view of an objective history and reflect it into subjective interpretation or emotional interpretation.
Sí. Entonces es cuestionar la visión objetiva de una historia objetiva y más bien llevarla a un plano subjetivo, de una interpretación subjetiva personal.
We were hoping that one would understand the way that artworks make us able to feel that history can change.
Y de esta manera hacernos pensar sobre la posibilidad que tiene el arte para hacer un cambio.
I think I should stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. Bueno, un poco no les mencioné antes, pero es muy interesante ahora que uno ya conoce un poco más a profundidad el trabajo que significó en ese momento las actividades que hizo el Group Material. Y para los que no han visto la exhibición que está enfrente, los curadores de la muestra, Inti Guerrero de TEORETICA y Schreier Mavlian de la Tate Modern, buscaron los archivos y bueno, investigaron sobre las actividades que había hecho Group Material y basaron la exhibición que está enfrente en, de hecho parte del archivo está expuesto en la entrada teorética y en la fachada, y sobre eso los curadores se basaron para proponer una nueva mirada, y esa es la pregunta que quisiera hacerle ahora a Douglas, de qué estaba pasando, ¿verdad?, con artistas actualmente reflexionando sobre este tema de las intervenciones de Estados Unidos. Es como una evocación de lo que hicieron estos basados en esta investigación de estas actividades. Maybe could I ask you just now a question?
Can I make a comment on that, I think? The learning moment about the archive, save everything. Don't throw out anything, save it all. Because we had no idea when we were doing this work that it would have the kind of historical interest, but also the potential to generate other projects like this. If I'd thrown that stuff out, Inti and Shuair would have nothing, or they would sort of have a set of ideas, and save everything.
Sí, como una recomendación que guarden todo, porque en ese momento ellos no se tenían idea que ese material que ellos que había sido parte de su proceso y que habían guardado en algún momento iba a servir para montar una exhibición. Entonces, que guarden todo.
So my question is, yes, once you've seen the exhibition, how would you perceive the political action in that exhibition?
In this particular one? Well, in terms of practical politics, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to me that it would create that opportunity. What is apparent in viewing it just for one day today is that for the curators who used our archive, they were able to build a sense of affinities that goes beyond the fantasy of the North American political movements of the 1980s.
Sí, Lo que sirvió, este material de archivo que está en exhibición, sirvió para crear una idea de los movimientos políticos de los años 80 en Estados Unidos diferente de lo que realmente era.
Because as Inti wrote in the catalog and Shoei wrote in the catalog, the actual knowledge of what was a sort of more complete picture of the cultural developments of Central and South America were not available to us, particularly the younger members of Artist Call. And the projection of solidarity is a kind of a fantasy.
Okay, la proyección de la solidaridad es una especie de fantasía y nosotros allá en esa época no teníamos una noción real de los logros que se habían logrado a nivel cultural y político en esa época en Latinoamérica.
I mean, now it's 30 years later. I know what was happening within the FMLN and the degree in which political left-wing groups were killing each other while they were fighting against the Duarte regime.
30 años después, ahora sí ya sé qué es lo que se logró con el FMLN. Y además, 30 años después, ya también me entero de cómo los movimientos de izquierda se estaban matando entre ellos, entre ellos se estaban matando con el fin de derrocar a la dictadura.
And to make an aesthetic parallel, to be able to see now the work done here in Panama, in other areas that has a sort of level of sophistication, and to see it compared to the kind of ideological phantasmagoric investment from North America in the past is a kind of a beautiful resolution. It's beautiful for me to be able to see that because we did not know about the idea of a global or particularly Central and Latin American artistic evolution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, no.
Oh, okay. The idea is that, well, here's an example. After Artist Call, a group of the organizers were invited to go to Nicaragua, post-revolutionary Nicaragua.
Okay, un grupo de artistas del Artist Call los invitaron a Nicaragua después de la revolución.
And we were given the tour of all those sort of revolutionary moments, the agricultural cooperatives, the reorganizations of the peasant culture, the arts and letters, the opera.
Y nos hicieron una gira, un tour por nos mostraron todos los logros que se habían hecho a nivel de organización de campesinos, de alfabetización, de proyectos culturales, la ópera.
And these North American leftists were a little bit upset.
Y los representantes de izquierda de Estados Unidos estaban un poco decepcionados.
Because their fantasy of what it meant to have a revolutionary culture was not the same as what the Sandinista policy was.
Okay. Porque ellos tenían un ideal muy distinto de lo que significaba un movimiento cultural de izquierda, que era distinto de lo que se había logrado con la revolución.
Right, issues around women's rights.
Por ejemplo, asuntos de derechos de la mujer.
Issues around the way that cultural could be organized from the top down or the bottom up.
O el tema de si la cultura se organiza de arriba para abajo o de las bases para arriba.
I'm not saying that the fantasy of solidarity work in North America is as distanced as the colonialist imperative of those military regimes.
No quiere decir que la fantasía de la solidaridad de los Estados Unidos sea tan distinta de estos regímenes coloniales.
But they're related.
Pero están relacionados.
I think it's a difficult question, but it's related. And it has to do with the way that art could create a context of identification that I could see in this exhibition that would never have been able to be produced in the mid-'80s by those of us in New York. It was a projection onto a revolutionary culture that was much more problematic and much more difficult to actually interpret through art than we attempted to do.
Sí, que con el tiempo me doy cuenta que lo que nosotros estábamos haciendo era una proyección de lo que era una revolución, un ideal, y que lo que se logró es muy distinto de lo que nosotros pensamos que se podía lograr en ese momento.
But we know this as artists. The artists in the room know this. We get to make those decisions on our own with our work, right? We get to, in a sense, ignore history, ignore practicality, and create ideal contexts of critique.
Pero como artistas nosotros sabemos que podemos crear contextos ideales de crítica, ignorando la vida práctica real, ignorando la historia.
And like fictionalize, in a sense, the idea that we would have of progress.
Y ficcionalizar, crear una ficción sobre la idea del progreso.
The exhibition across the street now makes me think of that in many different ways. The way that works act both as memorials to the idea of the barbarity of the past, but also project different ideas about how that would become part of an emotional life of the future, independent of the real politics, right?
Entonces, que estos trabajos, independientemente de la política real, lo que reflejan es un ideal emotivo, personal, de cómo desde el pasado se quería visualizar el futuro.
When we organized Luchar back in 1982, we invited Artists in Exile in New York, the one that helped Artist Call get started, the show that helped Artist Call get started.
Ya, cuando iniciamos la exhibición esta, Luchar,
I phoned North American artists who I think did work that was, or that we thought did work that engaged some of the issues of U.S. imperialism.
Convocamos a artistas que nosotros pensábamos que estaban tratando el tema del imperialismo norteamericano.
And through Daniel Flores and other friends and Catalina Parra, we contacted artists in Central and South America who did propaganda for left-wing organizations.
Y al mismo tiempo convocamos artistas en Latinoamérica que estaban haciendo propaganda para movimientos de izquierda.
So you had the South American political practitioners and the North American dreamers.
Entonces teníamos a los practicantes, ejecutantes desde Latinoamérica, y en el norte teníamos a los idealistas y soñadores de Norteamérica.
And it was so interesting for me as a young artist because the North American artists were all calling me at the end saying, I'm so worried to be involved in a project like this that actually has to do with a historical disaster because my work is not political enough.
Okay, entonces los artistas norteamericanos me llamaban preocupados porque les preocupaba estar involucrados en un proyecto realmente revolucionario y de izquierda, y ellos consideraban que su trabajo no era lo suficientemente político, no tenía el suficiente peso político.
And the artists who are doing practical work within leftist organizations here and in North America were also phoning me and saying, but Doug, I'm worried that my work is not artistic enough.
Y al mismo tiempo los artistas, los propagandistas del sur y también de Norteamérica, los que estaban haciendo el trabajo práctico, los llamaban preocupados de que su trabajo no era lo suficientemente artístico.
And so in a way this exhibition I think is indicative of like a different context of contemporary work in which we can imagine the relationship between aesthetics and politics as influencing each other simultaneously, which in a way is what group material was interested in early on. Some people would call us activists, other people would call us artists. We said we're both, we're neither, right? In order to complicate and problematize the idea of the activist, but to also problematize and activate the idea of the artist.
Lo que Group Call quería hacer en ese momento era poner en cuestionamiento, problematizar la noción del artista y la noción del activista, poniéndolos a trabajar juntos, activistas y artistas, y al final ellos decían que no eran ni el uno ni el otro.
That was too long an answer. Anybody else? Yes.
¿Cómo trabaja la reacción de los artistas en Nueva York ante la guerra en Irak, en Afganistán y la reacción que tuvieron los artistas del grupo de él?
Oh, you don't need that.
The response of North American artists to the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in comparison to how they responded here at that moment.
I think that there's so many artists who are involved in the content or the subject, for sure. But the idea that there would be that level of institutional organization to support dissidents or to create a larger sense of political consciousness seems to be not possible.
Que si bien hay artistas que están preocupados por eso, ¿verdad? No se logró, no ha sido posible, no es posible lograr un movimiento a nivel institucional o organizativo como el que se logró en aquel momento.
It's a very difficult and different context. I think the way we would try to decipher the context would be a really huge project, mostly because of the way that media has changed, but also the way that the idea of political investment, particularly in North America, now happens.
Sería un proyecto muy interesante de analizar y de descifrar y tiene que ver, la imposibilidad tiene que ver, o la dificultad tiene que ver sobre todo con la manera como el medio, los medios de comunicación han cambiado.
Like in the United States, most people, a tremendous amount of people in the United States still believe that the investment of that the U.S. had in torture in Iraq and Afghanistan is a kind of a fiction. It never affected them, right? It's also interesting historically to remember that the context of torture that were used by the death squads in El Salvador came out of United States military training manuals. So it's in a way the same story, it's at a different place, and this time the way that the American culture responds to that level of militarism is much less active. I think the idea of introducing the fictional but also historical idea of the terrorist, right, as a kind of different kind of abstract agent within the idea of U.S. imperialism is, I think, also a key shift in this. But I'm not a political scientist. I know that if you travel in America and you ask people about U.S. involvement in the Middle East and try to describe it as protecting the oil revenues and organizing particular ideas of antagonism that are economically advantageous to the United States, the same way that the United States involvement in Guatemala and other areas here were based in defending the United Fruit Company, right? That if you try to explain that to people in the United States now, they'll say, well, what about 9/11?
Bueno, pues que lo que ha cambiado es la forma como la gente está respondiendo a los niveles de violencia, que aunque las técnicas de tortura que se utilizaban en El Salvador en aquella época, que vienen de los manuales militares del ejército de Estados Unidos y que son las mismas que se han aplicado en Afganistán y en Irak hoy en día, a pesar de que son las mismas técnicas de violencia, el público responde de una manera diferente y parte de esto es la noción del concepto del terrorista que se ha instalado en el imaginario y que eso tiene una función muy importante.
I mean, you know, in the old days we had a lot of conspiracy theories. And today it does appear that the sort of George Bushes of the world and the Osama bin Ladens of the world were somehow like working together, right? Because they've created a political climate in which actual democratic movements for independence are always related to this ultimate context of extinction. Whenever you get together and say, we want to be free, we want to work together, someone can say to you, be careful because the terrorists will come, right? Or be careful, the Americans will, either the drones are going to come and kill us or the terrorists are going to come and kill us. It's like this weird context of what appears to be a kind of collaboration around the terror that we are all that is inflicted upon us every day. I don't know about here, but in the United States it is an emotional organization of the subject. It's gotten beyond a political organization of the subject. It's an emotional organization of the subject.
Sí, que al final es un asunto que ya más que político es un asunto emocional, con la noción del terror y la noción de que todos están coludidos y que hay teorías de la conspiración por todas partes y que se ha creado como un mundo ficcionalizado que apela más a la parte emotiva. Entonces eso es lo que ha afectado a la manera como la gente, el público está respondiendo a estos niveles de violencia.
And also organized aesthetically and abstractly. For instance, when you walk through the airports in the United States, a voice comes over the loudspeaker until very recently and would say, the security condition is orange.
Y también la representación estética y abstracta de toda esta noción del terror, al punto de que si uno va caminando por el aeropuerto, una voz por un altoparlante anuncia que el nivel de seguridad es color naranja. Entonces,
And you know, it's the Siri voice too. That's what I mean by media changing. You know, it's not like any voice. It's a certain kind of a voice that is the one that's also telling you how to go to the movies or that you forgot to call your mother. Do you know what I mean? So it's a very different kind of political and cultural context, at least in America.
Por lo menos en Estados Unidos es un contexto político y cultural muy distinto. El tono de esta voz es un tono macabro, es un tono distinto, es un tono que bien podría estar diciéndote, se te olvidó llamar por teléfono a tu mamá, ¿verdad? Algo más emotivo, más distinto.
Yes.
I guess that's how annoying this Friday. Nowadays, this artist called movement, you would be all arrested.
It was true that it is actually also important that in those days, and I didn't mention it historically, but there was a bit of a gap around the way that the United States would allow there to be what is even called a nonprofit institution. It's called a 501c. 501c means that you can raise money and you don't have to give taxes to the government. And the 501c now is extremely, or at least until Obama was elected, through the Bush years, the 501c status, a religious organization is 501c, can raise money and give money to other groups how they want to. But with the double Bush regime, this changed a great deal. And now it may go back. Why? Because the right-wing organizations in the United States now, the Tea Party, are objecting to the governmental intervention in the idea of political fundraising.
Bueno, es que el contexto ha cambiado mucho también porque en ese momento había un vacío en la legislación que permitía que organizaciones no gubernamentales o sin fines de lucro pudieran recaudar dinero para donaciones sin tener que pagar impuestos. Y esto continuó hasta que la segunda administración de Bush ya empezaron a poner problemas para las organizaciones sin fines de lucro y es probable que ahora más bien se vuelva otra vez a crear un ambiente de que sí se pueden crear organizaciones sin fines de lucro que recauden dinero, pero es por un asunto político de la derecha.
It's ironic in a way because in the 80s, all the work that left-wing organizations did to try to limit presidential power and to try to get congressional approval for War Powers Acts, to sort of limit surveillance of domestic political activities, to create contexts of international association and movement, intellectual and cultural association between different countries, which was so difficult under then. Now the right wing is accusing Obama of the similar kind of executive presidentialism, and they're having tremendous success. They censor him at any given moment. It's very typical.
En ese momento todo lo que los grupos independientes y revolucionarios estaban peleando para lograr poner límites al gobierno, límites a la vigilancia del ámbito privado y de la vigilancia de los mismos movimientos, todo lo que se logró en ese momento y lo que se luchó en ese momento es la misma lucha que está haciendo ahora el movimiento de derecha contra Obama. O sea, lo que el grupo, el público, la gente estaba haciendo en ese momento es lo que ahora, las mismas luchas que están haciendo los de derecha para ponerle límites a Obama. Es lo que entiendo.
¿Qué la otra?
I wanted to come back to a point that you touched on earlier in relation to this kind of knife edge between activism and what would be a more conventional notion of artistic practice, even if it's avant-garde practice, but a more traditional, conventional notion of aesthetic practice.
Mm-hmm.
And how, what struck me, I'm very sensitive to the efforts of this extraordinary labour that you produced back in the 80s, and it's clearly had an effect at the level of public awareness, and in a sense, that's the success of the work, is that it was unequivocal, direct communication in an almost documentary sense of what was going on in another part of the world, and informing in North America how the US was implicated very heavily elsewhere. But precisely the terms I'm using, unequivocal, communication, documentary, there's a tension there, is there not, with another kind of aesthetic practice where, as it were, instead of having a real that you kind of report on. You have the artwork itself is the site of the real.
Mhm.
And I know it's a kind of, on one hand, one wants to kind of graphically reflect or comment or inform on something that's going on. I was wondering to what extent that you were having conversations back in the 80s, to what extent there were perhaps other artists who are not so represented in what you've shown this evening, who were trying to do something, and it's very hard to do. There are very few examples in avant-garde art of kind of a reflection on a political or geopolitical circumstance within a kind of avant-garde. I suppose my question is what place was there for something more on the side of the kind of enigma, things that precisely don't make sense?
Displacement of subjectivity, the alienation of identity, all the concepts of aesthetic invention that we understand as part of at least the modern project, if not art history in total. I mean, that's what my teachers, who are abstract expressionists, taught me, that the organization of who we are is ruptured by the epiphany around which we are faced when we look at something that is aesthetically organized to make us question what it means to be a human being. There is a break, right? Particularly around this idea of the avant-garde. There's a shock, there's a shift.
Well. La pregunta, si necesitan traducción, con mucho gusto, pero bueno, la pregunta es, ¿qué discusiones se estaban dando en esa época sobre el arte que no estaba necesariamente representado en ese grupo, que era un arte más bien vanguardista, que hablaba, que hacía referencia a lo que estaba ocurriendo en otra parte del mundo, pero no desde un punto de vista documental, sino más bien a través de algo más abstracto o vanguardista? Entonces, que si el grupo reflexionaba sobre eso, sobre el papel del arte más vanguardista, a la hora de hacer un comentario sobre lo que estaba ocurriendo en otra parte del mundo de una manera no documental. Esa es la pregunta, y la respuesta es lo que el arte abstracto es, I don't know, the answer really, I'm sorry.
I'll say it again, right? It's like this is the mantra. This is the sort of like context around which I became an artist, around those contradictions.
Este es el contexto en el que yo me hice artista, alrededor, en torno a estas contradicciones.
Which is what I tried to, in a sense, describe through the dual histories of the 60s and the 80s.
Que es lo que traté de describir a través de las historias duales de los años 60 y los 80.
Because for young artists in the 80s, the idea that art would provide a relationship to the real, right, was extremely important. We inherited the life and art discourse that was started in the 60s by Alan Caprow, by happenings, by activist projects of institutional critique, of Hans Haacke, of the conceptual movement. We were in a sense like those that saw the possibility through the generation that came before us that art could change life.
Nosotros los de la generación de los 80 heredamos de los años 60 la noción de que el arte puede cambiar el mundo. Nosotros heredamos del movimiento de los happenings, del arte político, esta idea de que sí podíamos cambiar el mundo, la vida.
The difficulty of that moment for artists of my generation was that there was existing a kind of a historical fallacy or a fiction that if you were involved in aesthetic innovation, it was somehow not related to the conditions of subjectivity that were existing within the world, right? That intuitive work was not epistemological work. That knowledge changes didn't change being. No, let me say it different. Epistemological work was not ontological work. That by changing knowledge, we were not changing being. And that was a mistake because the work, I'm not saying that they were the same, the work of the abstract expressionists and the work of those involved in documentary practices, but they were intimately related.
Que nosotros crecimos con la falacia de que, con el error de pensar que un cambio en el pensamiento no iba a cambiar, a provocar un cambio en el ser. Okay? A change in knowledge would not cause a change
in being.
In being.
And what my other teachers who were abstract expressionists were saying is that what art does is it changes being. It changes being. It changes, in a sense, the surface and context around which we recognize ourselves as human.
Mientras que mis maestros sí pensaban, sí defendían la idea de que el arte puede cambiar el contexto en el que nos definimos como seres humanos.
And the only way to do that, in a codified way then, was to identify with something that was only about itself, that was self-referential, right? Like an abstract painting. An abstract painting did not refer to this history, did not refer to politics, did not refer to the present. It only referred to itself. And the struggle that we would have together, here's the politics, right? Around the conditions of that kind of representation would cause us to re-examine what it means to be a human.
Entonces, nuestros profesores nos enseñaban que la única forma para que el arte podía cambiar al ser era cuando el arte hacía referencia solo a sí misma, cuando era un arte que no hacía referencia a otra cosa. Y estos cuestionamientos nos hacían a nosotros nos movían a nosotros mismos también para pensar de una manera distinta.
And for me, particularly around these events, and identification, as phantasmagoric as it was, with the revolutionary movements of South and Central America, an affinity or a relationship started to establish in my imagination between the idea of the aspiration for revolutionary struggle and the aspiration for a new idea of human identification through aesthetics. They're both a dream, right? They're both, in a sense, abstract. If you've done real politics, you know. You can plan the revolution, but in the end, you have to do the work to make it work. You know what I mean? You have to sit down and negotiate. You have to say, what do you want? Oh, you want that? Fuck, I didn't know you wanted that. I got to do something different. You know what I mean? It's like, you know what I mean? It's not like making an artwork, but in a sense, the context. Well, I should just let you say.
Que aunque fuera una identificación con algo fantasmagórico, con una idea de la revolución, para nosotros sí nos agarramos de esta idea de la revolución, por más fantaseada o fantástica que fuera, para creer en la posibilidad de que el arte sí podía cambiar al ser.
And I'm sorry to go on and on about it, but it's like so much my thing right now. And for me, particularly those very removed, unreal aspects of sort of a kind of like classic modernity were often, and we know this, they were invested with the idea of having revolutionary potential, right? Particularly the idea of abstract form, because around abstract form would come a speculative kind of philosophical sense of subjection. What is it? Who's it for? What does it do, right? And that speculation around the broad demands of abstract form, for many of the producers in the early part of modernity, was understood as producing a revolutionary subject, right?
Sí, que desde el arte, desde la modernidad, el arte, todos estos cuestionamientos sobre la subjetividad a través del arte, en el fondo lo que estaban buscando era crear un ser distinto también a través de los cuestionamientos que el arte subjetivo también producía.
And also in New York now we recognize this, I think in a different way, around political movements. Say for instance in Occupy. When Occupy happened, many of us in the old left who were so used to making agendas and lists, like ran down there and said, great, now we can have a big meeting and address the housing crisis or the war in Iraq. Like, let's make a list and we'll make a political movement.
Bueno, nos pasó ahora con el movimiento reciente Occupy, que nosotros de la vieja escuela de la izquierda, cuando vimos este movimiento Occupy, y los vimos todos, ahí fuimos con la intención de hacer listas y de hacer una agenda y decir, ok, muy bien, reunámonos, abordemos el tema de la vivienda, hagamos una lista, hagamos movimiento.
And the people there said, you're crazy. We refuse that too. We're not doing that either, right? We're not invested in the real. You want to do the politics? This is it right now. It's happening now, right? It's not that it won't have effect in the real, right? But it is in a sense organized around that, which you can't realize in the way that you would realize history through a document.
Y la respuesta de los de Occupy fue, no, nosotros no estamos involucrados con lo real o con lo práctico de esa manera. Nuestra política es esta. Este es nuestro acto político, no ir a hacer una reunión y hacer una lista, sino que este movimiento ya es el acto político en sí, que sí va a tener un efecto real y práctico, pero no de la manera de ser listas.
And this is like, in a way, like for me, was a kind of reconciliatory moment around the ideas that happened in the 80s, inherited from the 60s, about trying to create a context in which aesthetics and politics would live together. Power already knew this. Occupy showed it could happen in a local context, but the way that power works, at least in the United States, already knew that. Otherwise, the message in the airport that the security level is orange, right, would not have already had effect. Do you see what I'm saying? The idea that my feelings could be managed abstractly through aesthetic, in a sense, the management of affect through form is already part of the way that power works. Mm-hmm. And somehow now there's this chance where we could also participate that in a context of a resistant idea of a subject. I would postulate that it would be kind of anti-humanist, right? That it would be sort of against the narrations of progress, even left-wing ideas of progress. I would also like to propose that it's sort of like kind of non-human in the way that it could be close to an animal or close to other kinds of association. It would be non-reproductive. It wouldn't lead to making anything. No more families, no family of man, no reproduction, no more babies, no more like revolutions that are going to lead to new institutions. That it's kind of in a way destructive, a kind of destructive way of having an aesthetic association with other people. I'm sorry, I went on too long.
Ya, yo creo que lo del inicio, la clave es que las estructuras de poder desde antes ya sabían que la forma para llegarle a la gente era a través de la emoción, de cómo la forma estética puede llegarle y convencer y manipular a las personas. Si no, ¿cómo se explican que esta voz en el aeropuerto hablara con ese tono de voz? Entonces, well, that's it about, you know, how our form affects affect.
Because a purely formal revolutionary moment might be beyond empathy. In a way, and that goes back to this idea of solidarity. Like, because those North Americans back then, it was empathy for the other. And that idea of empathy for the other is in a way based in that idea of the real that you also may want to critique right now, right? Like the whole idea of documentary practice. I go to the disaster zone, I take photographs of the dying children, I bring it back to the ruling class. I say, look what you're doing. You have to stop. Has that worked yet? Sorry, that doesn't work, you know. Not that those photographs can't be moving in a different way that would then create a sense of emotional identification outside of the idea of the, I don't know, the real or the notion of our anchoring ourselves in the idea of feeling for other people. But that otherness, that empathy, in a sense, like produces within the idea of the document, the idea of the real, the idea of affinity, the idea of left progress, right? Or all things that seem to just add to the further and further alienation of people from what they might be now.
Que todo esta énfasis que han puesto los movimientos revolucionarios en lo que es la empatía y la afinidad por el otro, en realidad no han logrado nada. La revolución basada en la empatía no ha logrado nada. todas las fotos que traen, todo lo que tiene que ver con una conexión con lo real, con los documentos, las fotografías de gente que está sufriendo, de los niños pobres, que voy a la zona de conflicto, saco las fotos, regreso, las muestro el horror que está pasando en otras partes. En realidad eso no ha logrado nada. El nivel de empatía que eso produce, sí produce una emoción, pero no es una emoción que logre un cambio en lo real.
I mean, but also, sorry to go on and on, like thinking about it, like in the 80s, that group material show, those timeline exhibitions were actually like that, because to be in the context in which you would see memory overcoming history, and also to see the teleological idea that history progresses from one thing to the next as a fiction, means that you're able to see yourself outside of time, right? Not in this moment, but in any moment, which my old abstract expressionist teachers would say all artists do all the time. You know, you would ask Phil Guston who he's working with, and, you know, he would say Paolo Uccello, like, you know, in the 15th century, like that's who he's working with right now. That's his collaborator, right? And that idea of being, in a sense, beyond the constraints that are supposedly building us, and resistant of the idea of building a future, no more future, right? I think is a sort of more progressive idea of thinking about aesthetics right now.
Sí, que una idea mucho más progresista para pensar, reflexionar sobre la estética es romper con la cronología, con la linealidad del tiempo, y eso fue lo que propusimos en la exhibición del Group Call, que era la memoria por encima de la cronología histórica. Entonces menciona de un profesor que le preguntaba a otro artista con quién es su colaborador del momento, con quién está trabajando, y él decía Paolo Uccello, del siglo, no sé, XVI. Entonces que ese era su colaborador del momento actual. Entonces romper con las constricciones del tiempo.
Anyway, it's really contemporary, that problem.
Es un problema muy contemporáneo.
Hi.
We don't hear it, they're hearing it in the machine.
Sorry. Bueno, lo digo los dos. Actually, what I was thinking about is that you've been involved in other, like in other action groups.
Yes.
More recently, and for a very long time as well, like Wage and now Golf as well, and like
I'm a labor organizer.
yeah.
Adjunct professors, who are like adjunct professors in art schools, are the slaves that make the art world run.
Yeah.
But anyway, question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, what I was, it's like, I'm very interested in how, coming from this experience, that you were trying to engage in this, like, such a broad problem, and that was very real, like people getting killed. And now, and more recently, you've been also being involved in this other groups that are more art world based, but at the same time, people are also getting killed. Particularly, I mean, with the building of the new Guggenheim Museum. So I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on that, if possible.
Gulf labor, oh. Yeah, you can say it in Spanish.
Sí, que viniendo de esta, o sea, viniendo ya de una experiencia que trabaja con algo, o sea, con una guerra, ¿no? Y con las intervenciones y gente, o sea, las intervenciones militares y gente realmente muriendo. Ahora él también está involucrado con otros movimientos de artistas y que son basados más en el mundo del arte, pero que particularmente uno que tiene que ver con la construcción del Guggenheim en la isla Sadillat, que se llama la Isla de la Felicidad. Ahí también está muriendo gente, y que elaborara un poco en esa, cómo ahora puede, o sea, nada, que elaborara un poco en eso y sobre cómo el trabajo previo de activismo pues también como que influye en la manera en que se acerca a estas organizaciones.
So wait, what's the question again? Sadaya. Right. Right. And the relationship between that and this? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I got it. Yeah. There's a book here. I think there's a book somewhere in that question, right? No, seriously, because the relationship, you could also include ACT UP and the work of Graham Fury in the United States in the late 80s and early 90s. The relationship between the idea of a sort of like depiction or the real, right? And then the actual political agency of artists within institutional frameworks. We provide cultural capital, right? We bring value to other things that then they're able to capitalize into money, right? I mean, everything now is turned into money at some level. The Sadayat developments in Dubai is the perfect example. And as I think maybe you said in Spanish, the investment of the developers of that economic change in the Emirates into the Guggenheim global brand as that which would be able to bring high-level art culture to basically a giant complex of hotels and golf courses is enormous. I wish Waleed was here because he knows the number. My co-teacher of mine at Cooper. I think it's 500 billion. Is that right? In collecting, that's collecting money, okay? That's collecting money. That's money to buy art. What started Gulf labor was the shock for some of these artists who are part of a more close to a commercial system, particularly those who have either subject content orientation around Middle East identities and histories, where the Guggenheim said, we'll buy everything. We'll buy everything, right? And I guess this happens to artists often, but that made them feel that there was a level of financialization that they had to be aware of. Then when we were all in Sharjah at the biennial, the exploitation of labor there becomes quite obvious. And so for me, the contradiction between the critical promise of aesthetics, as we were talking about in the early 80s, right? That aesthetic contexts of identification could produce senses of affinity and sort of interaction between people that is true, becomes completely like a farce if the context around which your art is being exhibited and built is based in a slave economy. And I didn't really know that this was true, but when I was at the Sharjah Biennial, I was with a friend of mine who's from Bangladesh, and we went to the barbershop. The barbershop, like a barbershop in Brooklyn, where all men hang out during the day. It's mostly men there because they don't allow the women to come with the men. And we heard the story of like total deprivation and economic disaster that they have to live through. The connection is probably that Gulf labor is more organized to like put pressure on these organizations through the capital of artists, right? If you want to be able to use my work to develop your hotel situation, then you have to use fair labor practices. It's a simple contractual thing. Less, not necessarily less about building consciousness, but it's has more to do with the actual, like trying to, at the very highest level of cultural organization, negotiate for better labor conditions for the people building museums.
Ok, toda la reflexión gira en torno a las relaciones, a las condiciones laborales de las personas que están construyendo los museos, como el Guggenheim, que son casi como, bueno, no dijo la palabra, pero lo que interpreto es como la franquicia, la marca Guggenheim, que está por todo el mundo, que son espacios para el arte construidos por personas que están en condiciones laborales deplorables, digamos, o problemáticas, y el propósito que cumpliría el arte que va a llenar estos espacios. Y entonces esto lo lleva a la reflexión de lo que ellos pensaban en los años 80, de cómo el arte podría cambiar el mundo, pero cómo va a cambiar el mundo el arte si los espacios en los que se exhibe este arte están construidos de una manera que es injusta. Entonces lo que ellos o lo que él piensa es que hay que llevar a los niveles más altos de la organización cultural la exigencia de que si van a exhibir el arte de un grupo de artistas, sea con la condición de que las prácticas de ese museo o incluso de la gente que está financiando ese museo sean prácticas basadas en el comercio justo. Entonces ya no es tanto que el arte vaya a cambiar el mundo, sino que las condiciones en las que se exhibe el arte también reflejen un cambio de cultura.
There's other connections also, I think, around ideology and culture that I think are probably related. What else? Time to go?
Una última pregunta, si alguien tiene, quisiera hacer. Bueno, muchas gracias por haber estado hoy acá. Thank you, Douglas. Gracias.